family. It's your favorite queer radio personality, Anna DeShawn here, and it is March, which means it's Women's History Month, and that means we got to queer it out. I'm here with your favorite queer historian, Amanda. What's going on, Amanda?
Hello. Very excited about today's episode because I know that you love this person as much as I do.
I really do. I got mad respect, okay, for Ma Rainey. That is who we are digging into this week. She was before Bessie Smith, okay? She is the mother of the blues. Ma Rainey is that girl, okay? And you may have seen the movies, but let me tell you, nothing is better than hearing it from Amanda. Understand? So, Amanda, let's start in the beginning. Where is Ma Rainey from? I don't even know anybody knows, but you anybody knows, you know, because I feel like the year is confusing. People, there's some questions, but let's start in the beginning.
She was either born in Columbus, Georgia in 1886, April 26th, 1886. That is the birthday that Ma Rainey claimed for herself.
Oh, okay.
There is also census data that indicates she was actually born in September of 1882 in Russell County, Alabama, which is where her parents were from. So she was born between 1882 and 1886 in Alabama or Georgia.
Okay, just maybe 4 years and maybe two different states.
Yeah.
Which, for the context of this time, it is not really that uncommon to really not know, right? Because Black people weren't seen as fully human. Our records were not really kept up to date unless the slave owner had a reason to really be thorough about his books. So this is not uncommon. But my goodness, 4 years and two states is quite different. But maybe
well, she was only born 20 some odd years after the end of the Civil War. So yeah, there weren't great records. So, but she claimed April 26th, 1886 and Columbus, Georgia as her birthplace. So let's go with that.
Let's go with Georgia. Let's do it.
She had somewhere between 3 and 5 siblings. We know of 3, 2 brothers and a sister. It is possible there were 2 other siblings who either aren't in the historical record or died in infancy or childhood, unclear. But she was one of several siblings. You'll often see her name listed as Gertrude Melissa Nix Pridgett, but Melissa Nix is actually probably her sister's name. Again, records in the late 19th century, especially for Black families, a little confusing and spotty. So this is what we know.
And this is why Black Americans often will say, I don't know where I'm from, right?
Yeah.
The digging, the DNA tests have helped to narrow it down, but so much of our history was lost, ignored, not kept.
There is a wonderful genealogist named Walt Way who runs something called the Brister English Project, which is all about helping Black Americans trace their family trees as far back as they can. We'll put a link in the show notes because his work is amazing and you should definitely support him.
Well, I want to support and I want the information. Okay.
Yeah, he's amazing.
Let's keep going. So let's go with Georgia, 1886.
Yep.
Now, was she always a singer?
So as far as we can tell, she started performing at a very young age. There's not a ton of information about her family as a whole, although there's some indications that her parents might also have been performers. But she started performing around the age of like 12. She was in this talent show in her hometown in Georgia that was called A Bunch of Blackberries. And then from there, she went on to traveling tent shows, which were Black minstrel shows and vaudeville acts.
Also known as the Chitlin Circuit, right?
Yeah, this is a little bit before the Chitlin Circuit really got established. But yeah, it's definitely like the beginning of that touring route through the South and the Midwest.
And this is where Black performers went to go find careers. Like this is how they were doing their art full time, were these tents. We weren't allowed to go other places. We weren't allowed in the theaters, right? We could not go. But we had talent and we had money and we wanted to go outside and we wanted to celebrate. And so what we had to build it ourselves. And so that's what it looked like with these traveling tents, but then became the Chitlin Circuit, where so many of some of your favorite Black performers found a home in the very beginning of their career.
All of them. Pretty much all of them. If they were anybody between like 1905 and 1930, they were on the Chitlin Circuit at some point.
Yeah. because you gotta, if they don't, gosh,
It's a whole other
so
episode. We'll
many
get back to
things to
that.
say, Amanda.
I
But
know.
at the end of the day, there was no seat at no table for them, and they built their own table. Period. That's what
Hmm.
they had to do. And from what I hear, it was a lit time.
Well, and what's interesting with Ma Rainey, I'm going to jump ahead like 30 years. When Ma Rainey was at the height of her career and touring on the very well established Chitlin circuit, she was doing some of the first integrated shows in the Jim Crow South because she would not perform to segregated audiences, but she had white fans. So she was like, well, you got to sit with the black people or you don't get to come, which was an amazing amount of power and leverage that she had at the time.
And everybody loved her,
Oh, yeah.
right? From my understanding, because of her delivery. I mean, she had the gold teeth. She
Yeah.
she had these dresses that were just draped in like
Yeah.
these
She was an
pearls, and
icon.
she was shimmering all over the place, right? I mean, she put on a show.
She did. And sort of what's interesting about Ma Rainey, so she got married when she was around 18. She she was 18 to her early 20s, depending on what year she was actually born. But she married a performer who went by Pa Rainey, who was like 10 or 12 years her senior. And so that's how she became Ma Rainey, as opposed to Miss Gertrude or Madam Gertrude, which is sort of how she'd been performing before. Um, and so they started performing together, and she very quickly eclipsed like not only her husband but all of the other people in the troops that she was part of. Like she and her husband were part of this company called the Rabbit's Foot Company, which was a hugely popular black minstrel show, and she was sort of like support when they first got married. And very quickly people were like, can we just hear her sing, because she's great.
Which absolutely killed Pa Rainey's ego. Okay,
Yeah.
let me tell you,
This is my favorite. In 1914, they'd been married for about 10 years. At that point, they were still performing together. They were with a group called Tolliver Circus and Music Extravaganza, and they were billed as Rainey and Rainey, the assassinators of the blues. And I just want that on a business card.
the assassinators of the blues.
Yes.
I don't know if that's good or bad, but
I feel like it's good in this context.
in this context,
But that was
I'm
sort of like
confused.
the end of them performing together, because after that people were like, we really just only care about Ma Rainey. So Ma and Pa Rainey split in 1916, and then Pa Rainey actually died in 1920.
Wow. But that's where the
But
name came from. She she
yes.
she got married to Pa Rainey. They started performing together for
Hmm.
many years, and then she just stuck with Ma Rainey. That's how she was known, and that's what she
Yeah.
stuck with, right?
Yeah, I mean, it was her married name for, I don't know, 12 years, 14 years, something like that. Yeah, so she was not about to give it up, because she had started to build all of this, notoriety and popularity. So she wasn't going to change her name. He could go be something else if he wanted to, I guess, but she wasn't about to change hers.
No, she was good. And what I think is really interesting about Ma Rainey is that she really took care of her people, right? And
Yeah.
and her band. And one person, when I was learning about Ma Rainey, and I was like, what? Was Thomas Dorsey, who I've
Hmm.
always known as the father of gospel music, was a part of her band. Is that right?
Yes. So Ma Rainey got signed to a record label called Paramount in 1923, which was actually a little bit late, like sort of a couple years behind other less prominent gospel singers. But for whatever reason, she didn't get signed until 1923. She went and recorded her first couple of albums in Chicago, and then she went out on tour. And this is at the absolute height of the Chitlin circuit. So she went out on tour, and Thomas Dorsey was her band leader. And he gained most of his notoriety as a musician touring with Ma Rainey. And he loved her, absolutely loved working with her. She was notoriously very generous with her musicians, and also with her chorus girls, which we'll talk about in a second. She paid everybody well. She was respectful of them. We're going to get back to the chorus girls.
Oh, yes, we are.
And she actually also bought all of her musicians new instruments when they joined her on tour. And so Thomas Dorsey was a huge fan of hers, and once said he wrote memoirs that haven't been published yet, but he said in those memoirs, after performing and working with Ma Rainey, there was nowhere else to go but to the Lord.
Of course. 'Cause where else are we going but up? Okay. Because Ma
Yeah.
Rainey she was provocative. She was what they would maybe call like a nasty girl. Okay. She would get a little
Yeah.
freaky on stage. She was all about that. Okay.
She was
Liberated.
she was vulgar. She was absolutely vulgar,
Vulgar.
and a lot of what made her such a dynamic performer, um, because people didn't kind of like Ma Rainey. They loved Ma Rainey. And part of what made her so dynamic was her ability to perform it I'm going to say like a man, because the 1920s and 30s were a very, heteronormative and gendered time in the United States, unlike now when we've totally solved all those problems, by the way.
This is where we all take a collective deep breath. Okay. I think it's also very interesting to talk about history right now when you feel like you are reliving it in real time in your own reality. History seems real close right now.
It does, and in a way that is honestly, that is sometimes comforting to me. Because the thing about Ma Rainey is Ma Rainey was unapologetically and not subtly queer. And this is a Black woman in the South 50 years after the end of the Civil War who was really not subtle about her queerness at all. And that wasn't really a mark against her, right? Like, that was part of her act. The fact that she embraced her sexuality. Angela Davis actually wrote this really great book called Blues Legacies and Black Feminism, where she talks about the Black female experience, sort of specific to blues music, and also how it lays the foundation for modern Black female artists. There's a direct line you can draw from Ma Rainey to Meg the Stallion in terms of being seen as over sexualized or vulgar or whatever. Ma Rainey was doing it first, and people loved it, because she was embracing all of the emotions of the Black female experience, specifically in the Jim Crow South at the time, and unapologetically.
And liberated. I mean,
Yeah.
she was a liberated woman. And
Yeah.
she was getting paid too. I think getting paid and feeling that type of power and over your own life at a time where women really did not have power over their own lives. Ma Rainey was a unicorn in some ways, very unique.
She was.
In how she was handling her own business.
Yeah, so Ma Rainey was a very shrewd businesswoman, which is not to say that she wasn't taken advantage of. Paramount Records absolutely underpaid and undervalued her. It is unlikely that she ever saw any royalties for the 100 songs that she recorded for them. Many of which, according to the Recording Academy, who awarded her a Lifetime Achievement Award posthumously in 2023, are easily recognizable as part of the American musical canon. So she didn't make a ton of money off of her actual recordings, but she could negotiate a contract. And at the height of her celebrity and popularity, she was commanding about $350 a week, which would be $6,400 a week in today's money, which was a huge amount. Most of the, well-known performers on the Chitlin circuit earned about $185 a week. Bessie Smith, at the height of her fame, earned $600. So there's Bessie Smith, Ma Rainey, and everybody else.
Wow.
She was shrewd in her negotiations and smart with her money. So by the time her career sort of ended in 1935, which is when she retired, she had enough money to go back to Georgia and buy 2 movie theaters and manage them for the next few years until she unfortunately died of a heart attack when she was just 53. But she had managed to play the long game with her money, which was very, very, very difficult at the time for a variety of reasons.
Which I think is really fascinating that she took care of her money so well, given that she was so giving with it. Like she took care of her musicians, like you said, right? And from what I can tell, she lived the life. Okay, she had drivers. She always had a fur on. She was just that girl. Yeah.
She traveled with an entourage. Like, if you want to know where modern artists got the idea for an entourage, it was Ma Rainey. She just traveled with a group, like her choreographer and like stylists and just like random people. That is how she moved through the world. And part of that was a safety thing, right? Like she bought her own bus in cash, and hired the people to drive it, partly because some of the places they were going, there wasn't a hotel she could stay in safely, at least not one that was up to her standards, shall we say. So she just moved through the world as an absolute diva and unapologetically and intentionally. One of the ways that Paramount marketed her when they were releasing her records was as the gold neck woman of the blues, because she wore so many gold necklaces.
So much jewelry. She was adorned. She adorned herself. And she looked like wealth. I mean, I think that was one thing that was part of her act. It was like, this is who I am. This is who I am. And it came through in her music. It came through in how she dressed. But child, it also came through in her actions, okay? Because she's got some stories. Okay.
So Ma Rainey subverted expectations in a lot of ways, right? Because she was this powerhouse performer. She just dripped in gold and diamonds. She even had gold teeth that used to flash when she sang, which I love that description. And Ma Rainey would be the first to say this, so I'm not like talking out of school. Ma Rainey was not what was considered attractive at the time. Like if you look at pictures of her now, I'm like, oh, she's totally cute. She's just kind of short and curvy. But at the time, she was considered to look like a potato, basically. Which I read that in a newspaper article, and I was like,
in a newspaper article?
Yeah.
They called
Yeah, and they were basically like, even though she looks like a potato, she sure can sing.
Jeez.
But that did not stop her from being an incredibly desirable partner, shall we say. So, of course, she had a very famous relationship with Bessie Smith. In like sometime around like 1914, 15, they stayed friends for their entire lives, but sort of were romantically entangled at that time. And then, can we talk about the chorus girls now?
Can we please talk about the chorus girls? And can we talk, and let us please also not gloss over the fact that her and Bessie Smith were a thing. Okay, don't get it twisted, family. Like, we've been here, okay?
Yeah.
Black lesbians have been outside for a very long time. And the fact that it's been depicted in films. I mean, Queen Latifah as Bessie and Monique was playing Ma Rainey. Like, y'all, this was a thing. Okay. But
and I actually found while I was researching this, there is a very popular story that Ma Rainey kidnapped Bessie Smith when they first met and like forced her to join the Rabbit's Foot company that Ma and Pa Rainey were a part of. But that is not what happened. They were just both performing, sort of on this tour path, and that's how they met.
Absolutely. And Bessie Smith was looking to make a come up. Okay. Ma Rainey had been there. Bessie Smith was on the come up. And it was one of these things where the teacher, right, teaches so well that Bessie Smith then, right, begins to be a larger star than even Ma Rainey was. But I do think it had so much to do with the way Ma Rainey presents herself. I think it was because of her skin. I believe it's because she was so dark skinned, because she was so curvy, and that she was not sexually appealing, right, to white men or to men in general. But the ladies did, okay? Specifically her chorus girls. I don't know if it was a line she asked on when she was interviewing them or what, but the chorus girls, though, loved them some Ma Rainey.
They did, and in 1925, Ma Rainey was arrested for holding a lesbian orgy in her home with some of the women in her chorus.
You better lesbian orgy it, okay?
Plot twist, She was taken to jail, and Bessie Smith had to bail her out.
The shenanigans. Now, I want to know. I want to know who tipped off the popo. Okay, I want to
I
know.
know, right? Like, come on.
Who was mad? Who was mad? Okay.
You know that was a neighbor. You know that was like a nosy neighbor. You just know.
Or a jealous boyfriend. Okay, because
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Ma Rainey was we actually think Ma Rainey got remarried at some point in the 20s, but there really isn't any documentation around it. We don't know anything about that second husband. But from that, I think we can glean that Ma Rainey was dating men and women at this time, or just inviting them to her house for, naked party time.
I mean, why can't I have it all? I believe this was the way Ma Rainey thought. Why can't I have it all?
Yeah, and so the thing about Ma Rainey is that she was not subtle about her queerness, and it wasn't just in her actions, it was also in her songs, many of which she wrote herself, which was unusual for the time.
Yeah, I mean, she was that girl. What was it, 1928, Amanda? She wrote
Yep.
Prove It On Me.
Mm-hmm.
Now, family, if you have never heard the song, which you probably haven't, let's be very clear. Most of you are probably not listening to blues. And if you are, you definitely probably are not going back to
But you should be.
1928, you know what I'm saying, music. But I have to read a little portion of these lyrics because Chile, she was out here, okay? Prove it on me. This one section, it goes, they say I do it. Ain't nobody caught me. Sure, got to prove it on me. Went out last night with a crowd of my friends. They must have been women, because I don't like no men. Yo, it don't get no more black and white than
Relatable.
those lyrics right there.
Well, and the best part, the absolute best part is, even if you wanted to make the argument that, like, well, in most of her songs, she's like being a little subtle and like maybe that's not what it's meant, or like certainly people didn't support that. The marketing poster for Prove It On Me, when Paramount released it, was a drawing of Ma Rainey in a 3-piece suit, like a skirt suit, but still a 3-piece suit with a fedora, chatting up 2 young women while a police officer looked on in the background. That was the marketing poster for this song.
Yes. And can I say, at one point when I was doing research about Gladys Bentley, that song is often attributed to Gladys Bentley and not Ma Rainey.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to think at some point they had to have met, like at some point they had to have crossed paths, being these 2 big stars who were black, who were women, who were also lesbian out here out loud with money. Like we would talk about the 1% today. They were like the 0.25%.
They really were.
Of black women out here making music that actually talked about being with women.
Yeah. And so it was often rumored that that Ma Rainey didn't tour north of Virginia, which is actually not true, because she toured in New York at least twice, and specifically in Harlem. So that is where she would have met Gladys Bentley. And she was a household name. Like, her records sold all over the country. So even if they didn't meet, which, if I had to guess, I would say that they probably did in Harlem at some point. But even if they hadn't, Gladys Bentley would have been absolutely familiar, like, with her music, her vibe, her everything. So
that's the book.
Yeah, they're absolutely in the same
We need the
circles.
When Ma Rainey met Gladys Bentley. Like, we just need to, in that moment.
Somebody write that historical fiction novel and I will read it immediately.
You understand? Read it. Do a podcast. Okay, I'll produce the podcast. I mean, just something.
Graphic novel. We need a graphic novel. That's what we need.
Oh my gosh. The gold jewels alone will make the graphic novel just pop. I think. And the reason I also bring that up is because so often we learn these stories without the full context of what was going on in the rest of the world. And we are also talking about the Harlem Renaissance, right? This is where Gladys Bentley was in Harlem. But Ma Rainey was down south in Georgia, right, doing her thing. And we can't also forget the people who were out in California and in LA, right? Who were in Hollywood. There was Black Hollywood happening at the same time. And there were all of these movements that were happening Black folks were looking to advance, right,
Hmm.
and take care of themselves and make a living doing their art, when the country, when the state, right,
Yeah.
did not see them as fully human, and yet
Yeah.
all this magic was happening.
And this was globally such a time of upheaval for the entire world, right? So the Civil War ends in, the late 1860s. Takes a few years to actually end and make
Mm-hmm.
sure everyone knows. And we go straight from that into the ramp up to World War One, which is followed by the Roaring Twenties, and then it all sort of comes to this crashing halt in the 1930s with the Great Depression and the lead up to the Second World War. So all of this was happening at the time that Ma Rainey and her contemporaries were out and like making this amazing music, inventing entirely new musical forms that would endure, for centuries. And it's just crazy to take a step back and sort of look at what was happening, not just in the country broadly, but in the world overall, that all of this was happening at the same time.
Absolutely. And those pieces about what was happening in the world directly impacted their art, right? I think
Hmm.
such a big part of Ma Rainey's story was that the Great Depression hit, and we already know what happens to the most
Hmm.
marginalized among us. They get hit and hurt the worst, and they often
Yeah.
get hit and hurt first. And Ma Rainey really just fell off the face of the planet, didn't she?
She really did. So she got fired from Paramount in 1928 because her style of blues, which we now call classic blues because she pretty much invented it, she perfected it, she didn't invent it. Her style of blues was sort of like falling out of popularity as people became more interested in, especially in swing. So she got fired from Paramount. She kept touring for a few more years, but at sort of a diminished level of fabulousness. You know what I mean? Like she no longer had like the 20-person entourage and like the
Yeah.
private, bus and all that. And then she ended up retiring from music in 1935. But because she had been a shrewd businesswoman and had managed to play the long game with her money, she could retire back to Columbus, Georgia, where she bought a couple of movie theaters and then managed them for the next 4 years. And then she actually had a heart attack when she was just 52. So she died in 1939.
Wow. And one of the reasons I understand that Paramount dropped her too was just that she was unwavering. She was not
Yeah.
interested in singing blues a different way. She
Nope.
wasn't interested in adapting her style to whatever people wanted to listen to then. She was like, this
Nope.
is me, this is how I sing, this is my music.
Hmm.
And she was unapologetic about that. And
Yeah.
and I think what a travesty that
Yeah.
after she did that, she became this businesswoman, bought these two movie theaters, and then she just suddenly passes away.
Hmm. Yeah. And she really did just sort of like fall out of history, if not for performers, especially like Bessie Smith, who kept her name alive, and then other performers carried her name forward, even all the way up to Janis Joplin, who credited a lot of her style, her vocal style, to Ma Rainey's very distinct, sort of like deep, gravelly, dynamic voice. And that is the only reason that like her name recognition survived long enough. I think for people, especially August Wilson, when he wrote Ma
Yes.
Rainey's Black Bottom,
Yes.
to start to pull her story kind of out of the ash pile of history.
That's right. That's right. It was everybody else who made
Hmm.
sure that we never forgot who Ma Rainey was to music, to culture. Yes.
Hmm.
And we thank them for that because I think she would have been lost. And I'm sure that there
Yeah.
are other people we don't know who have been lost, who were a part of that time, whose stories and names weren't uplifted. And this
Hmm.
is why we are here, Amanda. This is why
Exactly.
we are doing this series. One of the reasons is because we want to make sure nobody forgets that
Yeah.
we have always been here.
Yeah. And unapologetically here. Like Ma Rainey was not in the closet as a bisexual woman. She just wasn't. And most people were not like looking the other way and sort of like subtly ignoring it because they liked her music. Like everybody knew what Ma Rainey was about, including Paramount when they marketed her songs. And I think that part is so important too, because she was a Black person. She was a Black woman. She was an entertainer. She lived in the Jim Crow South. You know, we're talking about like, you know, 1902 to like 1935 for her, you know, for her like heyday. And that's major, that she was just completely, absolutely, unapologetically herself for that entire time period. And people loved her for it. They didn't ignore it and like everything else. They loved the whole Ma Rainey, which included her queerness.
Come on. So family, if you're watching this and you've ever felt insecure, maybe unsure, Chile, tap into your Ma Rainey energy. That's what we need. We need some Ma Rainey energy around here. And remember that you are beautifully, wonderfully made. That you, however you want to show up, child, either they with it or they not, and we still gonna be okay. I feel like that's the energy Ma Rainey had. And if you enjoyed this video, then you got to stay locked in, because we got more on the way, more history that we are queering out, because our stories are important, and we are not going to let anybody forget that we have always been here. So yeah, so stay locked in with me and Amanda right here in March for Women's History Month, where we are what? Queering it out.